I was scrolling through the Sunset Years community forum when I saw a post that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. And a 68-year-old woman from Portland was sharing her heartbreak about how her adult children had told her she was useless now after retirement, suggesting she moved to a nursing home because she, quote, served no purpose anymore. The comments were filled with outrage. How could they treat their mother like a burden? She raised them and now they want to discard her. What kind of monsters tell their own mother she's worthless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What made my blood run cold wasn't just the cruelty of that woman's story. It was that I was reading it while sitting in my home office in Willowbrook, Connecticut, just 2 days after my own daughter Vanessa had said almost the exact same words to me during what she called an intervention about my future. "Mom, you need to face reality," Vanessa had said, sitting across from me in my living room with her husband Derek and my son-in-law's smug expression of agreement. "You've lost your purpose. You're not a professor anymore. You're not shaping young minds. You're just existing. And frankly, it's depressing to watch." I'm Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, and until 18 months ago, I was a respected literature professor at Thornfield University, where I'd taught for 37 years. I had tenure, a corner office overlooking the campus quad, and graduate students who hung on my every word about Victorian poetry and feminist literary criticism. My retirement party had been attended by hundreds of colleagues, former students, and academic friends, who called me a, quote, pillar of the university and an inspiration to generations of scholars. But according to my daughter, none of that mattered anymore. "Look at yourself, Mom," Vanessa had continued, gesturing around my comfortable 3-bedroom colonial home. "You spend your days reading novels, tending your garden, and writing in that diary like you're still relevant. You're not contributing to society anymore. You're not earning money. You're not building anything. You're just consuming resources." Derek had nodded along, adding his own assessment. "Vanessa's right, Eleanor. You're living in the past. This house is too big for one person, your savings are just sitting there not being productive, and you're basically waiting to die. It's not healthy." The intervention, as they called it, was supposedly out of love and concern for my well-being. They had researched lovely assisted living communities in nearby Brookhaven. "You'd have built-in social activities," Vanessa explained, sliding glossy brochures across my coffee table. "Organized meals, medical care on site, and other people your age to talk to. You wouldn't be so isolated and purposeless." When I'd asked what would happen to my house, the house my late husband Charles and I had bought 30 years ago, where we'd raised Vanessa, where every room held memories of birthday parties and holiday dinners and quiet Sunday mornings, Derek had been quick with an answer. "Well, obviously it would need to be sold to pay for your care," he said. "These places aren't cheap. But don't worry, Vanessa and I have been looking at the property values in this neighborhood, and you'd get enough to cover several years of assisted living costs." "And then what?" I'd asked quietly. "Then we'll figure something out," Vanessa said with the casual dismissiveness I'd noticed creeping into her voice over the past year. "Maybe you'll qualify for Medicaid by then. The important thing is getting you the help you need now." I'd sat there listening to my only child, the daughter I'd raised as a single mother after Charles died when she was 12, the daughter whose college education I'd paid for with my professor's salary, the daughter whose wedding I'd funded and whose house down payment I'd helped with, explain to me why my life no longer had value. "Think about it logically, Mom," she'd said as they prepared to leave. "What do you actually contribute now? You're not working, you're not raising children, you're not taking care of a spouse, you're just taking up space. Living in a house meant for a family, hoarding money that could be put to better use, clinging to a life that's over." As I read that forum post from the woman in Portland, those words echoed in my mind. Taking up space, hoarding money, clinging to a life that's over. The parallels were unmistakable. Both of us were women who had dedicated our lives to others, She to raising her children, me to educating thousands of students, only to be told we were worthless once we'd outlived our usefulness to our families.
But here's what Vanessa and Derek didn't know when they sat in my living room 2 days ago, explaining why I needed to liquidate my life to make room for their plans. They didn't know that I was the sole beneficiary of my late mentor Dr. Abigail Hartwell's estate, worth nearly $800,000, which had been finalized just 3 weeks before their intervention. They didn't know that my retirement portfolio had grown substantially beyond what they'd calculated. And they certainly didn't know that I'd been quietly watching their spending habits, their new luxury cars, and their recent kitchen renovation that seemed far beyond Derek's insurance adjuster salary. Most importantly, they didn't know that their little speech about my worthlessness had just inspired me to find a very specific purpose for the remaining years of my life. As I closed the forum and set down my coffee cup, I looked around my home office, the room lined with books I'd collected over 4 decades, filled with essays from students whose lives I'd changed, and decorated with awards for my contributions to academic literature. Vanessa was wrong about one thing. I wasn't just taking up space. I was taking up space that apparently she and Derek had already mentally claimed as their inheritance. But if they thought I was just a purposeless old woman waiting to die and hand over my assets, they were about to discover exactly how much purpose a retired literature professor could find in the careful, deliberate rewriting of her will. The woman in that forum post had been abandoned by her children. I was being systematically devalued and manipulated by mine. But unlike her, I had something Vanessa and Derek wanted, and suddenly I had found the perfect purpose for my retirement years, making sure they never got it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand how I went from beloved mother to purposeless burden in my daughter's eyes, I need to take you back to the beginning of my retirement journey, when everything seemed perfect and full of promise. 18 months ago, my retirement celebration at Thornfield University was everything I dreamed it would be. The faculty lounge was packed with colleagues, former students who'd traveled from across the country, and administrators who praised my, quote, transformative impact on 3 generations of scholars. Dean Richardson gave a speech about how my Victorian literature courses had become legendary on campus, and how my mentorship had launched dozens of successful academic careers. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, he announced to thunderous applause, has shaped minds, changed lives, and elevated our understanding of feminist literary criticism. She leaves behind not just a legacy, but a living testament to the power of passionate teaching. Vanessa had been there, beaming with pride as speaker after speaker shared stories about how I'd influenced their lives. She gave her own short speech about growing up with a mother who was, quote, 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 brilliant, dedicated, and inspiring. I remember feeling so grateful that my daughter truly understood the work I devoted my life to. Ahue, at 66, I felt like I was entering the most exciting chapter of my life. My pension was generous, my health was excellent, and for the first time in decades, my time was completely my own. Charles and I had always planned to travel extensively in retirement, before cancer took him 12 years ago, and I was finally ready to honor those dreams, even if I'd be fulfilling them alone. My house in Willowbrook was perfect for this new phase. The mortgage had been paid off years ago, the neighborhood was quiet and safe, and I had my garden, my library, and enough space to host the dinner parties I'd always been too busy to throw. I imagined Sunday brunches with former colleagues, book club meetings in my sunroom, and quiet evenings working on the novel I'd always planned to write. More importantly, I was excited about being more available to Vanessa and her family. During my teaching years, I'd always felt guilty about missing some of her childhood milestones due to evening classes, weekend conferences, and summer research trips. Now I could be the grandmother and mother I'd always wanted to be, with time to really focus on family relationships. Woo! Those first few months were blissful. I threw myself into projects I'd been postponing for years. I redesigned my garden, turning it into something worthy of better homes and gardens. I organized my lifetime collection of books, creating a cataloging system that would have impressed the university librarians. I started learning Italian, planning a trip to Florence to see the places where Elizabeth Barrett Browning had lived. Vanessa called regularly during this period, and our conversations were warm and engaged. She seemed genuinely interested in my retirement activities, and often brought Derek and the kids by for Sunday dinners. 8-year-old Grace would curl up with me on the couch while I read her stories, and 10-year-old Michael loved helping me in the garden. Derek was polite and seemed to appreciate the home-cooked meals after what he called Vanessa's experimental cooking phases. "Mom, you seem so happy," Vanessa had said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "I was worried retirement might be difficult for you, but you're absolutely glowing. I feel like I'm finally living instead of just working," I told her. Don't get me wrong, I loved teaching, but there's something wonderful about waking up each day and choosing what to do with it. It was during one of these family dinners that I made what I now realize was a crucial mistake. I had been sharing my excitement about finally having time to read all the novels on my someday list, when Derek made an offhand comment about my endless free time. "Must be nice to have 0 responsibilities," he'd said, with what I thought was good-natured teasing. "No deadlines, no boss, no schedule, living the dream." "Well, I do try to stay productive," I'd replied, feeling suddenly defensive. "I'm working on several writing projects, and I'm thinking about auditing some courses at the community college, maybe taking up watercolor painting." That's when Vanessa had made the suggestion that seemed innocent at the time but now feels like the first step in a carefully orchestrated plan. "Mom, you should think about what you want to do with all your assets eventually," she'd said casually, while loading the dishwasher. "I mean, this house is huge for one person, and you've got all those investments just sitting there. Have you thought about estate planning?" I'd brushed off the suggestion. "Vanessa, I'm 66, not 96. I have plenty of time to worry about that." I know, she'd laughed. "I just meant, it's smart to think ahead." Derek's been learning about financial planning, and he says most people wait too long to optimize their assets. "Right, honey?" Derek had nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, absolutely. Eleanor, you'd be amazed how much money people lose just by not being strategic about their holdings. Real estate, investments, insurance policies, there are so many ways to maximize value if you plan ahead." At the time, I'd been touched by their concern for my financial well-being. It felt like evidence of how much they cared about my future security. Looking back, I realized it was the first time they'd shown any interest in my finances, and it wasn't really about my security at all. But in those early retirement months, I was too content to notice any red flags. I was living my dream life in my beautiful home, surrounded by books and memories, finally free to pursue my passions without the constraints of academic schedules. I felt purposeful in an entirely new way. Not because I was fulfilling obligations to an institution, but because I was finally fulfilling obligations to myself. I had no idea that my daughter and son-in-law were watching my happiness and seeing something entirely different. Wasted resources, missed opportunities, and assets that could be put to better use. The woman who had spent nearly 4 decades shaping young minds was about to discover that her own daughter had been studying her all along, waiting for the perfect moment to reshape her mother's life to serve their purposes instead of her own. For the next 6 months, my retirement felt like everything I'd dreamed it would be. The financial planning conversation with Vanessa and Derek had actually sparked something positive. I decided to take control of my estate planning properly, but on my own terms. I scheduled meetings with my attorney, Patricia Bellingham, and my financial advisor, Thomas Kemp, to review everything and make sure my affairs were in order. The meetings were enlightening. Patricia walked me through my current will, which was embarrassingly outdated, still reflecting my life from 15 years ago, when my primary concern was ensuring Vanessa's college education if something happened to me. Thomas showed me detailed projections of my portfolio's growth and explained how my pension, combined with my investments in the house's value, meant I was actually quite wealthy by most standards. "Eleanor," Thomas had said, pulling up charts on his computer, "you're in an enviable position. Your pension covers all your living expenses, your house is paid off, and your investments have been performing excellently. At this rate, you could live very comfortably for another 30 years and still leave a substantial inheritance." More surprisingly, 3 weeks after that meeting, I received a call from Patricia about Dr. Abigail Hartwell's estate. Dr. Hartwell had been my mentor when I was a young professor, and we'd maintained a close friendship until her death the previous year. Apparently, she'd named me as the sole beneficiary of her considerable estate, $800,000 in investments and property, because, as her will stated, I was the daughter she never had, and the scholar who carried forward her life's work. I was stunned, not just by the inheritance, but by the timing. Just as I was entering retirement and worrying about making my money last, this windfall appeared like a gift from the universe. I decided not to tell Vanessa and Derek about Dr. Hartwell's bequest immediately. I wanted to process it myself first and figure out how to use this unexpected wealth meaningfully. During this period, my relationship with Vanessa seemed to reach new heights. She started calling me more frequently, often just to chat about her day or ask for my advice on parenting decisions. She brought the children over more often, and I loved having Grace and Michael help me with my Italian lessons or listen to my stories about famous authors. "Mom, you're like a completely different person since retirement," Vanessa said one afternoon as we watched the kids play in my backyard. "You seem so relaxed and confident. I think this was exactly what you needed." Derek had become more engaged too, asking thoughtful questions about my garden and even helping me install new shelving in my library. He'd started bringing coffee when they visited, remembering that I preferred dark roast, and he'd listen attentively when I talked about the books I was reading. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about what you said about estate planning," he mentioned one Sunday over dinner. "Vanessa and I have been doing some research, and we'd love to help you think through your options. Not to pressure you, but just to make sure you're maximizing everything for your own benefit." I appreciated their interest. It felt like they genuinely cared about my well-being and wanted to help me navigate this new phase of life. When Derek suggested I consider putting some assets in trusts or exploring ways to reduce my tax burden, it seemed like sound advice from someone who worked in finance-adjacent fields. "Have you thought about gifting some money annually?" Derek asked. "There are tax advantages to spreading wealth transfer over time, and it might be nice to see Vanessa and the kids benefit from your generosity while you're alive to enjoy it." The suggestion made sense, and honestly, it appealed to me. I'd spent so many years focused on my career that I'd missed opportunities to spoil my family. Now I had both the time and the resources to be the generous mother and grandmother I'd always wanted to be. I started small, offering to pay for Grace's piano lessons when Vanessa mentioned the cost was straining their budget. Then I covered Michael's summer camp fees when Derek mentioned they might have to skip it this year due to unexpected car repairs. Each time, Vanessa and Derek were appropriately grateful, and the children's excitement made every penny worth it. "Mom, you don't have to do this," Vanessa would say, but I could see how relieved she was when I insisted. "What's the point of having money if I can't help my family?" I'd reply. "This is exactly what I want to use it for." The pattern continued throughout the fall. I paid for new school clothes, contributed to their kitchen renovation fund, and even helped with a family vacation to Cape Cod that they said they couldn't afford otherwise. Each contribution felt meaningful and appreciated, and I loved feeling needed and useful to my family in this new way. My social life was blossoming too. I joined a book club at the local library, started attending lectures at the community college, and had reconnected with several retired colleagues who lived in the area. We'd meet for lunches, where we'd discuss our latest reading projects, or plan cultural outings to museums in Hartford or New Haven. "You've really found your groove," my friend Dorothy Ashford observed during one of our weekly coffee dates. "I was worried you might struggle with the transition from such a demanding career, but you seem happier than ever." She was right. I felt purposeful in a way I'd never experienced before. Instead of serving an institution's needs, I was finally serving my own interests, while also being more available to my family than I'd ever been able to be during my working years. The guilt I'd carried for decades about missing school events or being too tired for bedtime stories was finally lifting. I started hosting regular Sunday dinners again, something I hadn't done since Charles was alive. Vanessa, Derek, and the children would arrive around 2 o'clock, and we'd spend the afternoon cooking together, the kids helping with simple tasks, while the adults prepared more complex dishes. These gatherings felt like everything I'd missed during my busy academic years, unhurried family time, where we could really talk and connect. During one particularly lovely Sunday in late October, as we were all raking leaves in the backyard, Grace ran up to me with a handful of colorful maple leaves. "Grandma Eleanor, can you write a poem about these? Like the ones you used to read to students?" I spent that evening crafting a simple verse about autumn and change, and the next week Grace proudly recited it to her class for a poetry assignment. When Vanessa called to tell me how proud Grace had been to share her grandmother's poem, I felt a sense of accomplishment that rivaled any academic recognition I'd ever received. This was the life I'd imagined when I retired, contributing to my family's happiness, sharing my knowledge and resources generously, and feeling appreciated for who I was rather than just what I could produce professionally. Derek and Vanessa's increased attention felt like natural appreciation for my new availability and generosity. I had no idea that what I interpreted as family bonding, they saw as successful conditioning. While I was enjoying feeling needed and valuable to my family, they were carefully studying my spending patterns, my emotional triggers, and exactly how much I was willing to give when approached the right way. The stage was being set for much larger requests, but in those golden autumn months, all I could see was everything finally falling into place, exactly as I'd hoped it would. The first crack in my perfect retirement paradise appeared in early December, though it was so subtle I almost missed it entirely. I was hosting my usual Sunday dinner when Grace mentioned something that made me pause mid-conversation. "Daddy, when are we going to move into Grandma's big house like you said?" she asked innocently while helping me set the table. Derek's face flushed immediately, and he quickly distracted Grace with a task in the kitchen. Vanessa laughed it off, saying, "Kids say the silliest things, don't they?" But I noticed the look that passed between them, sharp, warning, almost panicked. When I asked Grace later what she meant, she seemed confused. "Daddy said, maybe someday we could live in your house, because it's so much bigger than ours. But then, Mommy told him to stop talking about it." I felt an uncomfortable flutter in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. Surely it was just Derek admiring my house, maybe fantasizing about upgrading from their modest two-bedroom colonial. People daydream about beautiful homes all the time. But then I started noticing other small things that hadn't registered before. During their visits, Derek had begun taking photos of different rooms in my house, claiming he wanted to show Vanessa's cousin Eleanor's amazing decorating. When I offered to give him a tour for better pictures, he quickly said the ones he had were fine. Vanessa had started asking oddly specific questions about my daily routine. "Mom, do you ever get lonely in this big house? Don't you worry about something happening and no one knowing? Or have you thought about what you'd do if you needed help with things like grocery shopping or cleaning?" The questions felt caring on the surface, but something about the timing and frequency made me uneasy. The financial requests had also evolved in a way that was hard to pinpoint, but definitely noticeable. Instead of asking for help with specific expenses like piano lessons or summer camp, they started presenting more vague opportunities that required larger amounts of money. "Mom, Derek's been offered a chance to invest in his colleague's new insurance agency," Vanessa mentioned casually one evening in January. "It's a really solid opportunity, but we'd need about $15,000 to get in at the ground level. Have you ever thought about diversifying your investments into local businesses?" When I asked for more details about the business plan or suggested they speak with my financial advisor Thomas, Derek became surprisingly defensive. "Eleanor, I appreciate your caution, but this is more of a relationship-based opportunity. My colleague doesn't really work with outside advisors. It's about trust and timing." I declined to invest, citing my preference to stick with my current portfolio strategy. Derek's reaction was cold. Not angry exactly, but there was a definite shift in his demeanor for the rest of the evening. The warm, engaged son-in-law was replaced by someone who seemed to be calculating something behind his eyes. Around the same time, I started noticing that their expressions of gratitude for my help had become more perfunctory. When I'd paid for Grace's piano lessons, Vanessa had hugged me and called me the most wonderful mother in the world. But when I covered their heating bill after Derek mentioned an unexpected spike, Vanessa simply said, quote, "Thanks, that helps," and immediately moved on to discussing other expenses they were worried about. The pattern became more apparent in February. Every conversation seemed to steer toward money, either expenses they were struggling with, opportunities they couldn't afford, or observations about how much space and resources I had compared to their needs. "It must be nice to have so much extra money that you don't even think about costs," Vanessa said one afternoon when I mentioned buying new curtains for my bedroom. There was an edge to her voice I'd never heard before, almost resentful. "Well, I'm fortunate to be comfortable," I replied carefully, "but I still budget and make thoughtful decisions about spending." "Do you, though?" Derek interjected. "I mean, you bought that expensive garden furniture last month, and you're talking about renovating the guest bathroom. Meanwhile, we're debating whether we can afford to fix our washing machine. or if we should keep using the laundromat. I felt immediately guilty and offered to help with the washing machine, but Derek waved me off. That's not my point, Eleanor. My point is that you have more money than you could spend in a lifetime, living alone in a house meant for a family, while we're struggling to provide basic comforts for your grandchildren. The comment stung, partly because there was truth in it that I couldn't deny, but mostly because of the accusatory tone. It felt like I was being blamed for having financial security in retirement, something I'd worked 37 years to achieve. Their visits became more frequent during this period, but the quality of our interactions changed. Instead of the relaxed family time I'd come to treasure, conversations felt more like assessments. Derek would comment on things I'd purchased, asking detailed questions about costs and necessity. Vanessa would make observations about how much house I had for just one person, or how quiet it must get living alone. "Mom, don't you think you'd be happier somewhere with more social interaction?" she asked one evening. "I worry about you rattling around in this big house with no one to talk to during the week." When I mentioned my book club, my coffee dates with Dorothy, and my volunteer work at the Literacy Center, Vanessa dismissed them. "But those aren't real relationships, Mom. Those are just activities. What if you got sick? What if you had an emergency? Your book club friends aren't going to drop everything to take care of you." The implication was clear. I needed them more than they needed me, and I should be grateful they were willing to be involved in my life at all. The breaking point came in late February, during what should have been a pleasant family dinner. I'd made Grace's favorite lasagna, and had bought a new puzzle for Michael, just because I'd seen it at the store and thought he'd enjoy it. As I was showing him the puzzle, Derek made a comment that revealed more than he probably intended. "Eleanor, you know you can't keep buying the kids affection forever, right?" he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Eventually they're going to grow up and have their own lives, and all this stuff isn't going to matter." The comment was supposedly a joke, but it hit me like a physical blow. Was that what he thought I was doing? Buying affection? And more disturbingly, was that what I was actually doing without realizing it? That night, I lay awake replaying months of interactions, seeing them through this new lens. The increased visits that coincided with my increased generosity. The way conversations always seemed to circle back to my resources versus their needs. The subtle but persistent suggestions that I was living a lifestyle that was somehow excessive or inappropriate for a woman my age. I started paying closer attention to their behavior during subsequent visits. Derek would walk through my house with an appraising eye, making comments about the value of various items or rooms. Vanessa would sigh when discussing their cramped living situation, always in contrast to my, quote, excessive space. They'd exchange meaningful looks when I mentioned any purchase or expense, as if they were keeping a running tally of money I was wasting. The warmth and appreciation that had characterized our interactions during the fall had been replaced by something that felt more like entitlement mixed with resentment. They seemed to view my comfortable retirement not as something I had earned through decades of hard work, but as an unfair advantage that somehow disadvantaged them. Most troubling was the realization that they'd stopped asking about my interests, my reading, my volunteer work, or anything about my life that didn't relate to my resources. The woman who had once been a respected professor, whose opinions and insights they'd valued, had been reduced to a source of financial support and a holder of assets they increasingly seemed to view as rightfully theirs. I told myself I was overthinking things, reading too much into innocent comments and natural family dynamics. But deep down, I could feel something fundamental shifting in our relationship, and it was making me question everything I thought I knew about my daughter's love for me. The discovery that shattered my remaining illusions came on a rainy Thursday morning in March, completely by accident. I was looking for my reading glasses and decided to check Vanessa's purse, thinking I might have left them there during our shopping trip the previous day. She was upstairs helping Grace with a school project, and her purse was sitting on my kitchen counter, where she'd left it after arriving. As I rifled through the usual collection of receipts, lip balm, and tissues, my fingers closed around what felt like a small notebook. I pulled it out, thinking it might be an address book where she'd written down my glasses' location, but what I found instead made my blood freeze. It was a spiral-bound notebook with Asset Assessment EW written on the cover in Derek's distinctive handwriting. My hands trembling, I opened to the first page and found detailed notes about my house, including room dimensions, estimated square footage, and what appeared to be property value calculations. The second page contained a comprehensive list of everything valuable I owned: oriental rugs, living room and dining room, est. $15,000. Grandfather clock, hallway, antique, pos. $8,000. Sterling silver tea set, $3,000. Art collection, various rooms. Need appraisal. But it was the third page that made me feel physically sick. Under a heading that read monthly income versus expenses, Derek had calculated my pension payments, estimated my utility costs, grocery expenses, and other living costs. At the bottom, circled in red, was a figure labeled monthly surplus, $3,200. The next several pages were even more disturbing. They contained detailed observations about my daily routines, my social connections, and what Derek had labeled as, quote, dependency factors. Under this heading, he'd written notes like limited close friends, mostly acquaintances, no romantic relationships, health good but concerns about aging, and most chillingly, strong emotional attachment to grandchildren, primary vulnerability. As I continued reading, I realized I was looking at what amounted to a psychological profile designed to identify my weaknesses and motivations. There were notes about my guilt complex regarding V's childhood, and observations that I was eager to prove value to family post-retirement. One particularly devastating entry read, EW desperately wants to feel needed, responds positively to suggestions that she's helping family achieve stability. The notebook contained detailed records of every financial gift I'd given them, along with notes about my reactions and their success rate with different types of requests. They'd been tracking my generosity like a sales team tracking conversion rates. But the most shocking section was titled Timeline for Asset Transfer. It outlined a 3-phase plan. Phase 1, complete. Establish pattern of financial dependence. Build emotional case for increased support. Phase 2, in progress. Introduce concept of unsustainable living situation. Emphasize isolation and impracticality of current lifestyle. Phase 3, target summer. Present assisted living option. Position as caring solution while accessing real estate equity. Under Phase 3, Derek had written detailed notes about assisted living facilities, their costs, and calculations showing how selling my house would generate enough money to, quote, fund care for 5 to 7 years, while providing substantial surplus for family stability. At the very back of the notebook, I found what looked like a rough draft of a legal document, a power of attorney form with my name typed in the appropriate places. In the margins, Derek had scribbled notes about gradual competency concerns and natural progression of aging-related decisions. I sat at my kitchen table, holding this evidence of my daughter and son-in-law's calculated betrayal, and felt something inside me break and reassemble simultaneously. Every loving gesture, every expression of concern, every moment I'd thought we were building a closer relationship, it had all been part of a carefully orchestrated plan to manipulate me out of my home, my independence, and ultimately my assets. The voices upstairs brought me back to the present. I quickly photographed every page of the notebook with my phone, then placed it exactly where I'd found it in Vanessa's purse. When she came downstairs 20 minutes later, I was sitting in my living room with a cup of tea, trying to appear normal while my entire world had just been turned upside down. Sorry we've been here so long, Mom, Vanessa said, checking her phone. Grace needed help with this family tree project, and you know how she likes to make everything perfect. No problem at all, I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. I love having you here. As I watched her gather her things, including the purse that contained the evidence of her deception, I felt like I was seeing her for the first time. This woman who looked like my daughter, who had my eyes and Charles's stubborn chin, was essentially a stranger who had been studying me like a laboratory specimen for months. Oh, before I forget, Vanessa said, pausing at the door, Derek and I have been talking, and we think it might be good for you to visit some of those senior communities we researched. Not to move in or anything, she added quickly, just to see what they're like. You might be surprised by how nice they are. The casual way she delivered this suggestion, knowing what I now knew about their timeline, made me want to scream. Instead, I nodded and said I'd think about it. That's all we ask, Mom. We just want you to keep an open mind about what might make you happiest in the long run. After they left, I sat alone in my house that they had measured and appraised and planned to sell and tried to process the magnitude of their betrayal. This wasn't simply a case of adult children being concerned about an aging parent. This was a calculated con game, complete with psychological manipulation, financial surveillance, and long-term strategic planning. They had been watching me, studying me, documenting my vulnerabilities, and crafting their approach based on what would be most likely to succeed. Derek's notebook revealed that they understood exactly which emotional buttons to push: my love for the grandchildren, my guilt about not being available enough during Vanessa's childhood, my desire to feel useful and valued in retirement. Most horrifyingly, they had been planning this since before I'd even fully settled into retirement. While I was celebrating my new freedom and looking forward to deeper family relationships, they were already calculating how to exploit my generosity and engineer my dependence on them. I thought about all the times I'd felt grateful for their increased attention, their helpful suggestions about financial planning, their concern for my well-being. Every single interaction had been part of their strategy to position themselves as my caring caretakers, while simultaneously undermining my confidence in my ability to live independently. The notebook made it clear that they saw me not as a beloved family member, but as an asset to be managed and eventually liquidated for their benefit. The woman who had dedicated her life to education, who had raised a daughter as a single mother, who had built a comfortable retirement through decades of hard work. In their eyes, I was just an elderly woman with more money than she needed and not enough sense to know what to do with it. But here's what Derek's careful calculations and Vanessa's manipulative strategies hadn't accounted for. I was still Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, Professor Emeritus of Literature, a woman who had spent her career analyzing complex texts and identifying subtextual meanings. I had been trained to read between the lines, to spot unreliable narrators, and to recognize when a story wasn't what it appeared to be on the surface. And now that I could see the real story they were telling, I was going to write a very different ending than the one they had planned. After discovering Derek's notebook, I knew I couldn't make any decisions based on emotion or shock alone. If they had been methodical in their manipulation, I needed to be equally methodical in my response. The next morning, I began what I mentally called my fact-finding mission. My first stop was my attorney, Patricia Bellingham's office. I had worked with Patricia for 15 years, and I trusted her completely. When I showed her the photographs of Derek's notebook on my phone, her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine alarm. "Eleanor, this is deeply disturbing," she said, scrolling through the images. "This level of surveillance and planning suggests a very serious intent to defraud you. The power of attorney draft is particularly concerning. That document could give them control over all your financial and legal decisions." Patricia explained that what Derek and Vanessa were planning appeared to be a form of elder abuse called, quote, financial exploitation. She'd seen similar cases where family members systematically undermined an elderly relative's confidence and independence to gain control of their assets. "The pattern is always similar," she told me. "First, they establish themselves as indispensable caretakers. Then they begin pointing out problems with the victim's current living situation. Finally, they present themselves as the solution, usually involving a move to managed care while they take control of the estate." She recommended I immediately change all my passwords, review my financial accounts for any unauthorized access, and consider hiring a private investigator to determine if there were aspects of their plan I hadn't discovered yet. "Patricia, I need to know something," I said as our meeting concluded. If they had succeeded in getting me to sign that power of attorney, what could they have done? Her answer chilled me. "Eleanor, with a broad power of attorney, they could have sold your house, accessed your investment accounts, and made decisions about your care, all supposedly in your best interest. Many elderly people in managed care facilities have no idea their families have liquidated their entire estates until it's too late." My next stop was Thomas Kemp's office. My financial advisor had been managing my portfolio for over a decade, and I needed to understand exactly what Vanessa and Derek would have gained access to if their plan had succeeded. Thomas pulled up my complete financial picture on his computer screen, and even I was surprised by what I saw. Between my pension, my investment accounts, the inheritance from Dr. Hartwell that I still hadn't told Vanessa about, and my house's current market value, my total net worth was just over $1.3 million. "Eleanor, you're quite wealthy by any standard," Thomas said. "Your current income significantly exceeds your expenses, so your wealth is actually growing each year. At this rate, Even if you lived to 100, you'd still have substantial assets remaining. This information felt surreal. While Vanessa and Derek had been presenting me as a lonely old woman wasting resources, I was actually in the top 10% of retirees financially. Their notebook had calculated my monthly surplus as $3,200, but they drastically underestimated my true financial position because they didn't know about Dr. Hartwell's bequest or the full extent of my investment portfolio. Thomas, if someone had power of attorney over my affairs, what could they legally do with these assets? His explanation was sobering. With the right legal documents, they could liquidate everything, claiming it was necessary for my care. Managed care facilities often cost $8,000 to $12,000 per month, so they could justify substantial expenses while potentially pocketing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The most disturbing part, Thomas said, is that this kind of financial abuse often goes undetected because the perpetrators are family members who appear to be acting in the victim's best interest. That afternoon, I followed Patricia's recommendation and hired a private investigator named Rachel Morrison. Rachel specialized in financial fraud cases and had extensive experience with elder abuse investigations. I want to understand the full scope of what they're planning, I told her, and I want to know if they've already begun implementing parts of their strategy that I haven't discovered. Rachel's first findings were available within 48 hours, and they were eye-opening. She discovered that Derek had been researching my financial situation far more extensively than I'd realized. He'd pulled my credit report using information from my mail, researched property values in my neighborhood through multiple real estate websites, and had even contacted 2 assisted living facilities for preliminary information about costs and availability. Most disturbing, Rachel found evidence that Derek had been photographing documents during their visits to my house. Using specialized software, she was able to enhance some digital photos from Derek's social media accounts and found partial images of my banking statements and investment reports in the backgrounds of seemingly innocent family photos. Eleanor, they've been conducting financial surveillance on you for at least 8 months, Rachel reported. This isn't opportunistic greed. This is a sophisticated, long-term plan. But Rachel's investigation also revealed something that gave me a significant advantage. Derek and Vanessa had been discussing their plans in text messages and emails, apparently feeling confident that I would never discover their communications. Through legal channels, Rachel had obtained phone records showing extensive communication between them and several assisted living facilities, elder care attorneys, and even a real estate agent who specialized in estate liquidation services. They had been building an entire infrastructure to support their plan. The good news, Rachel told me, is that they've created an extensive paper trail. If you decide to take legal action, we have overwhelming evidence of their intent to defraud you. During this investigation period, I had to continue interacting with Vanessa and Derek as if nothing had changed. This was perhaps the most difficult part of the entire ordeal. Every time they visited, every loving gesture from the grandchildren, every concerned comment about my well-being, it all felt contaminated by what I now knew about their true motives. The hardest moment came when Grace climbed into my lap one Sunday and said, "Grandma Eleanor, Mommy says we might get to see you every day soon. Wouldn't that be wonderful?" I realized they had been preparing the children for my move to assisted living, framing it as something positive that would bring the family closer together. The innocent excitement in Grace's voice nearly broke my heart, because I understood that she genuinely loved me and had no idea her parents were using that love as part of their manipulation strategy. During that same visit, Vanessa mentioned that she'd done some research and found a lovely facility called Sunset Manor about 20 minutes from their house. "Mom, I know you said you'd think about visiting some places, and I found one that's really special. They have a wonderful arts program, and I thought you might enjoy meeting some of the other residents." I agreed to visit, partly to maintain my cover, and partly because I wanted to see firsthand what they had planned for me. The tour was indeed impressive. Sunset Manor was a beautiful facility with well-appointed apartments, extensive amenities, and caring staff. But when I saw the monthly fees, $11,000 for a basic apartment, with additional charges for meals, activities, and care services, I understood exactly how they planned to drain my assets while maintaining the pretense of providing quality care. "What do you think, Mom?" Vanessa asked as we drove home. "I could see you being really happy there. You'd have so much social interaction, and we could visit all the time." It's certainly nice, I replied carefully, but it seems quite expensive. Well, that's what the equity in your house is for, Derek said from the driver's seat. You can't take it with you, and this way you get to enjoy the benefits while you're alive. That evening, I sat in my home office, looking through all the evidence Rachel had gathered, cross-referencing it with Derek's notebook and my own observations. The picture that emerged was of two people who had spent months studying me like a problem to be solved, a resource to be harvested, an inconveniently autonomous person who needed to be managed into submission. But what they hadn't counted on was that I had spent my entire career studying human nature, analyzing motivations, and understanding how people reveal their true selves through their actions and words. I had been trained to spot unreliable narrators, to identify when a story's surface meaning was hiding a darker truth underneath. And now that I could see their story clearly, I was ready to start writing my own. Armed with knowledge of their plan but still maintaining my facade of ignorance, I was unprepared for how quickly and aggressively Vanessa and Derek would escalate their manipulation once they sensed I was receptive to the assisted living idea. What followed was a masterclass in psychological pressure that would have been impressive if it weren't so morally reprehensible. The campaign began in earnest the week after my visit to Sunset Manor. Suddenly, every conversation with Vanessa involved subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions about my declining capacity to live independently. She started pointing out things I'd supposedly forgotten, conversations we'd never had, plans I'd never made, concerns I'd never expressed. "Mom, don't you remember? Last week you said you were worried about maintaining the house," she said during a phone call, when I'd never expressed any such concern. When I gently corrected her, she responded with concern that was clearly manufactured. "Mom, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're starting to forget things, and it's really worrying Derek and me." The gaslighting was systematic and relentless. Derek began documenting everything I said and did during their visits, later contradicting my recollections with his notes. He'd claim I'd left the stove on when I hadn't, or that I'd seemed confused about what day it was, or that I'd repeated stories multiple times in one conversation.
"Eleanor, I think you should consider getting a cognitive assessment," he suggested one Sunday, his voice full of false concern. "There's no shame in acknowledging that we all need more support as we age." The most insidious part of their campaign was how they used my love for Grace and Michael against me. They began bringing the children over less frequently, and when they did visit, Vanessa would make pointed comments about how worried the kids were about me living alone. "Grace had nightmares last week about something happening to you in this big house with no one around to help," Vanessa told me with theatrical sadness. "She's too young to understand, but she senses that we're concerned about your safety." When I tried to reassure Grace directly, Vanessa quickly intervened. "Let's not burden the children with adult concerns, Mom. They don't need to worry about these things." The message was clear. My access to my grandchildren would be contingent on my cooperation with their plans. Derek ramped up the financial pressure as well. He began making calculated comments about the burden my independence was placing on their family. "Vanessa barely sleeps because she's so worried about you," he told me one evening. "She calls to check on you multiple times a day, and it's affecting her work performance. Her boss has actually commented on how distracted she's been." This was completely fabricated. Vanessa rarely called me more than twice a week, and our conversations were usually brief and focused on their needs rather than my well-being. But Derek delivered these lies with such conviction that I almost began to doubt my own memory. "K. Dalden." They also began manufacturing crises that required their intervention. Derek would call in the middle of the night claiming he'd been driving by and noticed my lights were all on at 2 a.m., which seemed unusual. When I explained that I'd been reading and hadn't realized how late it was, he responded with patronizing concern about my sleep schedule disruption. Vanessa started arriving unannounced, claiming she'd been worried because I hadn't answered my phone immediately when she called. She'd make a show of checking that I was okay, examining my house for signs of confusion or decline, and then expressing relief that I was managing for now. The most manipulative incident occurred on a rainy Thursday in April. I had gone grocery shopping and was carrying bags from my car when Derek appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, to help. Later, Vanessa called in tears. "Mom, Derek told me he found you struggling with groceries in the rain, nearly falling in your driveway. What if he hadn't been there? What if you'd fallen and no one knew where you were?" This was a complete distortion of reality. I had been managing my groceries perfectly well, and Derek's appearance had been so coincidental that I now suspected he'd been watching my house and waiting for an opportunity to create this narrative. When I tried to correct her version of events, Vanessa became emotional in a way that felt calculated to induce guilt. "Mom, please. I know it's hard to admit when we need help, but Derek and I love you too much to watch you hurt yourself trying to maintain this independence that isn't realistic anymore." The psychological pressure was relentless and sophisticated. They had clearly researched manipulation techniques for elderly people because they hit every classic pressure point: fear of isolation, concern for family burden, anxiety about physical decline, and the threat of reduced contact with grandchildren. But the moment I realized they had crossed a line from manipulation into outright fraud came when I discovered they had been intercepting my mail. I had been expecting a statement from one of my investment accounts that never arrived. When I called the company directly, they confirmed they'd mailed it to my address 2 weeks earlier. That evening, I set up a small security camera in my hallway, hidden behind some books on a shelf near my front door. Within 3 days, I had footage of Derek using a key I'd never given him to enter my house while I was at book club, going directly to my mail table, and photographing several pieces of correspondence before leaving.
They had been monitoring my financial communications and timing their manipulation based on information they were stealing from my private mail. The level of violation felt staggering. Armed with this evidence, I called Patricia Bellingham and Rachel Morrison for an emergency meeting. When I showed them the security footage, Patricia's face went pale. "Eleanor, this is criminal behavior. Breaking and entering, mail theft, identity fraud. Derek could face serious federal charges for this. What they're doing is called quote, grooming," Rachel explained. "It's a systematic process of breaking down your confidence and independence while making you feel dependent on them for validation and care. The ultimate goal is to make you so grateful for their protection that you'll voluntarily sign over control of your assets." They were right. I could see how effective their strategy would have been if I hadn't discovered Derek's notebook. The constant undermining of my confidence, the manufactured evidence of my declining capacity, the emotional manipulation involving my grandchildren. It was all designed to make me doubt my ability to live independently and view their control as a loving solution rather than exploitation. But what Derek and Vanessa didn't realize was that their escalation had revealed something crucial. They were working to a timeline. The pressure they were applying suggested they needed me to make a decision soon, which meant there was likely some external factor driving their urgency. During our meeting, Rachel shared a theory that chilled me. "Eleanor, based on their behavior patterns and the intensity of their current campaign, I suspect they may have already committed to something that requires access to your assets. They might have borrowed money against expected inheritance, or made purchases assuming they'll have control of your finances soon." "What kind of commitments?" I asked. "Real estate purchases, business investments, maybe even debts that need to be covered quickly. When adult children escalate financial abuse this aggressively, it's usually because they're under pressure themselves." That possibility added a new dimension to my situation. If they had already spent money they didn't have, expecting to recoup it from my assets, then my resistance to their plans wouldn't just disappoint them. It could expose them to serious financial consequences, which meant they were likely to become even more desperate and aggressive as their timeline approached. But I was no longer the confused, lonely widow they thought they were manipulating. I was Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, and I had spent my career analyzing complex narratives and understanding how stories really worked. Their story was about to take a turn they never saw coming. The breaking point came on a beautiful Saturday morning in May, during what Vanessa had described as a, quote, family celebration for my 68th birthday. I should have recognized the setup immediately. They'd insisted on hosting the party at my house. They'd arrived early to, quote, help with preparations. and Derek had brought an unusually large briefcase that he claimed contained surprise decorations. What I didn't expect was that they had invited witnesses to what would become the most humiliating betrayal of my life. The guests began arriving around noon. Derek's brother Kevin and his wife Linda, Vanessa's college friend Jennifer, and most surprisingly, Dr. James Thornfield, a geriatrician I'd never met who Derek introduced as a family friend who specializes in helping seniors navigate life transitions. At first, everything seemed genuinely celebratory. Grace and Michael had made me handmade birthday cards, and we had a lovely lunch on my patio. The conversation was warm and inclusive, and I began to think perhaps I'd been too paranoid about their recent behavior. But as the afternoon progressed, I noticed the other adults having quiet conversations in small groups, always breaking apart when I approached. Dr. Thornfield seemed particularly interested in observing my interactions, asking seemingly casual questions about my daily routines, my social connections, and my plans for the future. The trap was sprung during what Vanessa announced as present time. Instead of birthday gifts, Derek pulled a stack of documents from his briefcase and spread them across my dining room table while everyone gathered around. "Eleanor," Derek began, his voice taking on a formal tone I'd never heard before, "Vanessa and I have been working with Dr. Thornfield and some legal experts to put together a comprehensive care plan for your future. We wanted to present it to you today, surrounded by people who love you, so you'd understand that this comes from a place of genuine concern." My heart began pounding as I recognized some of the documents. There were brochures for Sunset Manor, financial projections showing how my assets could be optimized for long-term care, and at the bottom of the stack, a power of attorney document with my name already typed in. "We know this might seem overwhelming," Vanessa said, moving to stand behind my chair in what I now recognized as a blocking maneuver. "But we've done all the research for you. Dr. Thornfield has evaluated your situation and believes that transitional care would be the safest option." Dr. Thornfield stepped forward with a clipboard and what appeared to be a medical assessment form. "Mrs. Whitmore, based on the observations your family has shared with me about recent incidents, the confusion about dates, the difficulty managing household tasks, the concerning changes in judgment, I believe a cognitive evaluation would be appropriate." I stared at him in shock. "What incidents? What changes in judgment?" Derek immediately jumped in with his fabricated evidence. "Eleanor, last week you left the stove on for hours. You've forgotten conversations we've had multiple times. Just yesterday, you seemed confused about what day it was when I called." None of this was true, but Derek delivered each lie with such conviction that I could see the other guests nodding with concern. They had no reason to doubt him, and his performance was masterful. "And Mom," Vanessa added, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion, "you've been making some really concerning financial decisions. Spending money on things you don't need, talking about making large donations to charities you've never been involved with. We're worried someone might be taking advantage of you." This was particularly galling because I had never discussed any charitable donations with them, large or otherwise. But again, the witnesses had no context to recognize this as a lie. Jennifer, Vanessa's friend, spoke up supportively. "Vanessa's been so worried about you, Mrs. Whitmore. She's barely sleeping because she's concerned about your safety living alone in this big house." Kevin and Linda nodded in agreement, and I realized they had all been briefed on this narrative before arriving. I wasn't attending my birthday party. I was attending my own intervention, complete with predetermined outcomes and professional medical support for their conclusions. Dr. Thornfield pulled out a pen and moved closer to me. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like to do a quick cognitive assessment right now, just to establish a baseline. It's completely routine, and it will help us determine the level of support you might need." "I don't consent to an assessment," I said firmly, finally finding my voice. The reaction was immediate and coordinated. Vanessa gasped as if I'd confirmed their worst fears. Derek shook his head sadly. Dr. Thornfield made a note on his clipboard that I was sure would be documented as resistance to medical evaluation, or some similar phrase that would support their narrative. "Mom, this is exactly what we're talking about," Vanessa said, her voice rising with what sounded like genuine distress, but which I now recognized as performance. You're not thinking clearly. A cognitive assessment is standard for anyone your age. The fact that you're refusing it is actually very concerning. Derek moved to the table and picked up the power of attorney document. Eleanor, we've tried to approach this gently, but your resistance to reasonable safety measures is forcing us to be more direct. If you're not capable of making sound decisions about your care, then legally we need to step in to protect you. The room fell silent except for Grace asking quietly, "What's happening? Why is everyone upset?" That's when I realized the true cruelty of their plan. They had orchestrated this confrontation in front of my grandchildren, using the birthday celebration as cover for what amounted to a legal ambush. Grace and Michael were watching their parents systematically dismantle their grandmother's autonomy while being told it was an act of love. "We've already spoken with the staff at Sunset Manor," Vanessa continued, "and they have an apartment available immediately. We can have you moved in by next weekend, and honestly, Mom, I think once you're there and you see how much happier you are with social interaction and support, you'll thank us. And we've arranged for the house to be listed with a realtor who specializes in estate sales," Derek added, pulling out yet another document. "The market is excellent right now, and the proceeds will more than cover your care costs while providing some family stability that, frankly, we all need." There it was. The culmination of months of manipulation, surveillance, and psychological abuse, delivered as a fait accompli in front of witnesses who had been primed to see their actions as necessary and loving. Dr. Thornfield stepped forward again. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this feels overwhelming, but your family has documented concerning changes in your behavior and judgment. Combined with your resistance to reasonable safety measures, I'm prepared to recommend a formal competency evaluation." The threat was clear: cooperate with their plan voluntarily, or they would pursue legal means to force my compliance. I looked around the room at these people, some of whom genuinely cared about me, but had been fed lies, others who were complicit in a calculated fraud. I saw my grandchildren watching with confusion and fear, as the adults in their lives turned their grandmother's birthday into a tribunal. And I realized that this moment, this breathtaking betrayal disguised as concern, was exactly what I had been preparing for since discovering Derek's notebook 2 months earlier. "You know what?" I said, standing up from my chair and looking directly at Vanessa and Derek. "You're absolutely right. I haven't been thinking clearly lately." Relief flooded their faces. Dr. Thornfield reached for his pen, ready to begin documenting my cooperation. "I haven't been thinking clearly about what kind of people you really are," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "But that's about to change." I walked to my home office and returned with a folder containing copies of Derek's notebook, Rachel's investigation findings, and the security footage of Derek breaking into my house. "Dr. Thornfield," I said, placing the evidence on the table next to their carefully prepared documents, "before you make any recommendations about my mental capacity, I think you should see some evidence about the mental capacity of the people making these claims about me." The room went dead silent as I began spreading out photographs of Derek's asset assessment notes, his timeline for manipulating me into assisted living, and his detailed psychological profile designed to identify my vulnerabilities. Vanessa's face went white. Derek's mouth opened and closed without sound. "Happy birthday to me," I said to the stunned room. I just gave myself the gift of finally seeing exactly who my family really is. The silence that followed my revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity. Dr. Thornfield picked up Derek's notebook, with the kind of clinical fascination normally reserved for studying exotic diseases. Kevin and Linda exchanged glances that clearly said they wished they were anywhere else. Jennifer's mouth hung open as she processed that her friend Vanessa had apparently been running a sophisticated con game on her own mother. But it was Derek's reaction that told me everything I needed to know about who I was really dealing with. Instead of shame, embarrassment, or even anger at being caught, his face shifted into something cold and calculating. This wasn't a man who felt guilty about being exposed. This was a man who was already strategizing his next move. "Eleanor," he said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, "I think you're misunderstanding what these documents represent. These are just notes I was taking to help understand your needs and plan for your care. The fact that you're interpreting them as something sinister actually supports our concerns about your judgment." The audacity was breathtaking. Even with the evidence laid out in front of everyone, he was attempting to gaslight me and reframe my discovery as proof of my mental decline. Dr. Thornfield, however, was reading Derek's psychological assessment notes with increasing alarm. "Mr. Brooks," he said, looking up from the notebook, "these aren't care planning notes. This reads like a surveillance report. You've documented Mrs. Whitmore's vulnerabilities, calculated her emotional triggers, and outlined a timeline for asset transfer. This is highly concerning." Vanessa finally found her voice, but instead of addressing the evidence, she went on the attack. "Mom, where did you get these documents? Did you go through Derek's private belongings? That's exactly the kind of paranoid behavior we've been worried about. I found them in your purse, Vanessa, while you were in my house, in my home, plotting to steal my life from me." "Steal?" Vanessa's voice rose to a pitch that I recognized from her teenage years when she was caught in a lie. "Mom, we're trying to help you. Everything we've suggested has been for your safety and well-being." That's when Kevin, Derek's brother, spoke up in a way that surprised everyone. "Derek, I need to ask you something directly. Did you really document Eleanor's emotional vulnerabilities and call them dependency factors? Because that's what this notebook says." Derek's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "Kevin, you don't understand the complexities of eldercare planning. Sometimes, you have to be strategic about how you approach someone who's becoming resistant to necessary changes." "Strategic?" Dr. Thornfield set down the notebook and looked directly at Derek. "Mr. Brooks, what you've documented here isn't eldercare planning. It's textbook financial elder abuse. I've seen these patterns in court cases." The room's dynamic had shifted completely. The carefully orchestrated intervention where I was supposed to be the confused, declining elderly woman had become an exposure of Derek and Vanessa's criminal conspiracy. The witnesses they'd brought to validate their concerns were now seeing evidence of their manipulation. But Derek wasn't finished. In what I now recognize as a last, desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, he played what he thought was his trump card. "Fine," he said, his voice turning vicious. "You want to know the truth, Eleanor? The truth is that you're a lonely, bitter old woman who's hoarding resources while your family struggles. You live in a house meant for a family while your grandchildren share a bedroom. You have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes, while Vanessa works herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her children." The cruelty in his voice was shocking, but what followed was worse. "You know what your problem is? You think you're still important. You think you still matter. But you're not a professor anymore, Eleanor. You're not shaping young minds or contributing to society. You're just an old woman taking up space and clinging to resources that could actually make a difference in the lives of people who have futures ahead of them." The words hit me like physical blows, not because they contained truth, but because they revealed the depth of contempt Derek felt for me. This was who he really was when the mask came off. Someone who viewed elderly people as burdens, who saw my life's work as irrelevant, who thought my existence was justified only by what I could provide to others. But as I looked around the room at the shocked faces of the witnesses, I realized that Derek's explosion had accomplished something my evidence alone might not have. It had shown everyone present exactly who they were dealing with. Jennifer was staring at Vanessa in horror. "Vanessa, is this really what you think? That your mother doesn't matter anymore because she's retired?" Linda had moved protectively closer to Kevin, as if she was reassessing whether Derek might be dangerous in other ways. Most importantly, Grace and Michael were hearing their father describe their beloved grandmother as worthless, irrelevant, someone who was taking up space. The looks on their faces broke my heart, but also filled me with determination. "Derek," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling I felt inside. "Thank you for finally showing everyone who you really are." Dr. Thornfield stood up and began putting his assessment materials back in his briefcase. "Mrs. Whitmore, I owe you an apology. I was told by your family that you were showing signs of cognitive decline and poor judgment. What I see instead is a woman who has uncovered a sophisticated attempt to defraud her, and who has had the presence of mind to document evidence and seek appropriate help." He turned to Derek and Vanessa. "What you've planned here appears to constitute criminal elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. I'll be required to report this to the appropriate authorities. That's when Vanessa finally broke. Years of carefully constructed manipulation crumbled as she reverted to the tantrum-throwing child I remembered from her teenage years. "This is ridiculous," she screamed. "She's my mother. Everything we inherit from her should be ours anyway. Why should she get to live in luxury while we struggle? She's had her life. Now it's our turn." And there it was. The truth that had been hidden beneath months of fake concern and manufactured crises. This had never been about my well-being or safety. It had been about their sense of entitlement to my assets, their resentment of my comfortable retirement, and their belief that my life had no value beyond what I could provide to them. As the witnesses began gathering their things and making uncomfortable excuses to leave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete clarity about what needed to happen next. I walked to my phone and, in front of everyone remaining, called Patricia Bellingham. "Patricia, it's Eleanor Whitmore. I need you to implement the plan we discussed." "Yes, all of it. Immediately." As I hung up, Derek demanded, "What plan? What are you talking about?" I looked at my daughter. This woman who had used my love for my grandchildren as a weapon against me, who had surveilled my home and stolen my mail, who had just declared that my life no longer had value, and I felt the last vestiges of maternal obligation fall away. "The plan where I stop being a victim of this story and start being the author of my own ending," I said. "Vanessa, Derek, I want you out of my house. Now. And if you ever contact me again, the next conversation will be with the police and my attorneys." As they gathered their failed intervention materials and prepared to leave, Grace ran to me with tears in her eyes. "Grandma Eleanor, I don't understand what's happening. Are you really sick? Are Mommy and Daddy really trying to hurt you?" I knelt down to her level and took her small hands in mine. "Sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices. Your Mommy and Daddy have been lying about me and trying to take things that don't belong to them. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault, and I love you and Michael more than all the stars in the sky." "Will we still get to see you?" Michael asked, his voice small and scared. "We'll see, sweetheart. But no matter what happens, remember that your Grandma Eleanor fought back when people tried to hurt her. And if anyone ever tries to hurt you, I want you to fight back too." As the door closed behind them, I stood alone in my house that they had measured and appraised and planned to sell, and realized that for the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. The scared, confused elderly woman they thought they were manipulating was gone. In her place stood Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, Professor Emeritus, a woman who had spent her career analyzing complex narratives and understanding how stories really work. And their story was about to take a turn they never saw coming. The Monday morning after my birthday confrontation, I sat in Patricia Bellingham's office reviewing the most comprehensive legal strategy I'd ever been involved in. What had started as defensive planning to protect my assets had evolved into something far more proactive and far more satisfying. "Eleanor, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what we're implementing here," Patricia said, spreading out documents across her conference table. "This isn't just about protecting you from future manipulation. Based on the evidence Rachel has gathered, we're pursuing criminal charges, civil recovery, and complete restructuring of your estate to ensure this can never happen again." The first phase was already in motion. Rachel Morrison had spent the weekend compiling her investigation into a comprehensive report for law enforcement. The evidence was staggering: mail theft, breaking and entering, identity fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and what the prosecutor was calling criminal surveillance of a vulnerable adult. "The district attorney is taking this very seriously," Patricia explained. "Derek's notebook alone constitutes evidence of premeditated fraud. Combined with the security footage of him entering your home illegally and photographing your financial documents, they're confident about securing convictions. But the criminal charges were just the beginning." Patricia had also filed for immediate restraining orders against both Vanessa and Derek, prohibiting them from contacting me, coming within 500 feet of my home, or attempting to access any information about my finances or medical care. "Eleanor, within 48 hours they'll be served with papers that make any further harassment or manipulation attempts contempt of court," Patricia said. If they violate these orders, they'll face immediate arrest. More satisfying was the civil lawsuit we were preparing. Pennsylvania's elder abuse statutes allowed for treble damages, meaning that every dollar they had cost me through their manipulation could be recovered as $3 in damages. But Patricia had identified something even more powerful. Your state has what's called a, quote, fraudulent transfer statute, she explained. If we can prove that Derek and Vanessa made financial decisions or purchases based on their expectation of inheriting your assets, we can actually recover those assets, or their value. Rachel's investigation had uncovered exactly that. 3 months earlier, Derek and Vanessa had purchased a new SUV with a down payment that exceeded their monthly income. They had also made a $25,000 deposit on a larger house, telling the realtor they were expecting, quote, a family inheritance to cover the full purchase price. They essentially spent money they didn't have, counting on stealing your assets to cover the debt, Rachel reported. The SUV can be repossessed, and they'll forfeit the house deposit. But more importantly, these purchases provide additional evidence of their premeditated plan to defraud you. The most complex part of our strategy involved what Patricia called offensive estate planning. Instead of simply protecting my assets from their future manipulation, we were restructuring everything to ensure they would never benefit from my death, while simultaneously creating a legacy that would honor my actual values. I've prepared 3 different trust structures, Patricia explained, showing me detailed legal documents. The first is an educational trust that will provide scholarships for first-generation college students studying literature. The second is a retirement security fund for elderly women who have been victimized by financial abuse. The third is a fund specifically designed to help grandparents maintain relationships with grandchildren when their own children are trying to manipulate or control those relationships. Each trust was structured to operate in perpetuity, meaning that long after I was gone, my assets would continue working to help people in situations similar to what I had experienced. But the real genius of Patricia's planning was how these trusts interacted with my will. Under the new will, Vanessa and Derek receive exactly $1 each, with a detailed explanation of why, Patricia said with a slight smile. But here's the elegant part. If they challenge the will or contest these bequests, they trigger a clause that requires them to pay all legal fees for defending the estate, plus additional penalties that will actually cost them money to pursue. We had also established what Patricia called protection protocols for Grace and Michael. A separate trust would ensure their education was fully funded, but the money would be managed by independent trustees who could not be influenced or manipulated by Vanessa and Derek. If your grandchildren choose to have a relationship with you as they grow older, this trust can also provide support for that relationship, Patricia explained. But if Vanessa and Derek try to use the children's inheritance as leverage for manipulation, the trust structure prevents that completely. The most immediate satisfaction came from what Rachel had discovered about their current financial situation. Derek and Vanessa were far more vulnerable than they had realized, largely because their lifestyle had been subsidized by their expectation of inheriting my assets. They've been living beyond their means for over a year, Rachel reported. The house deposit, the SUV payment, credit cards, maxed out to cover daily expenses while they waited for their plan to succeed. When the criminal charges hit and the civil lawsuit proceeds, they're going to face immediate financial crisis. But Patricia had saved the most devastating element for last. Eleanor, based on Derek's notebook and his systematic surveillance of your finances, we're also pursuing a case for invasion of privacy and violation of your civil rights. This isn't just fraud. It's stalking, harassment, and what the law calls intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages for these violations could be substantial, but more importantly, they established a legal precedent that would protect other elderly people from similar abuse. What you've experienced and documented could change how these cases are prosecuted, Patricia said. Derek's notebook is essentially a manual for elder abuse. Prosecutors in other jurisdictions are already requesting copies to help them identify similar patterns in their own cases. As we finalized the paperwork that would set this legal machinery in motion, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering Derek's notebook: genuine excitement about the future. Patricia, I have one more request, I said. I want to establish a foundation that specifically helps elderly people who are being manipulated by their own families. I want them to have access to the kind of legal help and investigation services that I was fortunate enough to afford. That's a beautiful idea, Eleanor. What would you like to call it? I thought about the forum post that had started this entire journey, the woman in Portland whose children had called her useless and purposeless. I thought about all the elderly people who might be sitting in their homes right now, being told by their own families that their lives no longer had value. The second chapter foundation, I said, because retirement isn't the end of our story. It's the beginning of a new chapter, where we get to choose what really matters. By Wednesday, the legal wheels were turning with devastating efficiency. Derek and Vanessa were served with restraining orders at their home and faced with criminal charges that could result in federal prison time. The civil lawsuit demanded immediate return of all funds they had obtained through manipulation, plus damages that could potentially bankrupt them. But the most satisfying moment came Thursday afternoon when Rachel called with an update. Eleanor, you're not going to believe this. Derek and Vanessa have hired an attorney, and his first recommendation was that they should contact you to, quote, discuss a settlement to avoid criminal prosecution. They want to negotiate? They want to beg, Rachel said with obvious satisfaction. Their attorney apparently explained that the evidence against them is overwhelming, and that their only hope of avoiding prison time is if you're willing to show mercy. I sat in my beautiful home office, surrounded by books that had shaped my career and awards that recognized my contributions to education, and considered this request for mercy from two people who had spent months treating me like a burden to be disposed of. Rachel, please give their attorney a message. Tell him that Dr. Eleanor Whitmore is not interested in settlements, negotiations, or mercy. Tell him that I've found my purpose in retirement, and that purpose is making sure that what they did to me never happens to anyone else. The woman they had tried to manipulate into assisted living was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is ensure that people face the full consequences of their choices. And I was just getting started. The courtroom on the morning of Derek and Vanessa's sentencing was packed with people I never expected to see. Word of the case had spread through elder advocacy networks, law enforcement circles, and academic communities. Prosecutors from 3 other states had traveled to observe the proceedings, hoping to use our case as a model for their own elder abuse prosecutions. Judge Catherine Brennan had reviewed every piece of evidence meticulously over the previous 6 months. The trial itself had been swift but devastating. Derek's notebook, the security footage of him breaking into my home, and the documented pattern of financial surveillance had made their guilt undeniable. Both had accepted plea bargains rather than face jury trials that their attorneys warned could result in even harsher sentences. This case represents one of the most sophisticated and calculating examples of elder abuse this court has ever encountered. Judge Brennan began, her voice carrying the weight of months of careful consideration. The defendants didn't simply steal money from Mrs. Whitmore. They systematically dismantled her sense of self-worth, her confidence in her own judgment, and her trust in the people who should have protected her most. Derek stood at the defendant's table, looking nothing like the confident man who had documented my dependency factors in his notebook. 6 months of legal proceedings, financial devastation, and public exposure had taken their toll. The SUV had been repossessed, they'd lost the deposit on their dream house, and Derek had been fired from his insurance job when his employer learned about the criminal charges. Vanessa appeared even more broken. The daughter who had called me purposeless and suggested I was taking up space now faced the reality that her own life was in ruins because of choices she'd made. She'd lost her marketing job, her friends had distanced themselves after learning about the manipulation, and most devastatingly, she was about to lose custody of Grace and Michael. Mr. Brooks, Judge Brennan addressed Derek directly. Your notebook reveals a level of premeditation and psychological manipulation that is truly disturbing. You studied Mrs. Whitmore like a predator studies prey, documenting her emotional vulnerabilities and planning how to exploit them for financial gain. She held up a copy of Derek's notebook, which had become Exhibit A in the prosecution's case. You wrote that Mrs. Whitmore's strong emotional attachment to grandchildren was her, quote, primary vulnerability. You documented her daily routines, her social connections, and her financial resources with the cold calculation of a professional criminal. Derek's attorney had tried to argue that his client was simply a devoted son-in-law, concerned about his elderly relative's well-being. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Derek's explosion at my birthday party, witnessed by multiple people, had revealed his true character. The court sentences Derek Brooks to 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, mail theft, breaking and entering, and fraud, Judge Brennan announced. Additionally, Mr. Brooks will pay full restitution to Mrs. Whitmore in the amount of $347,000, representing treble damages for financial losses and emotional distress. Derek's face went white. The restitution amount would bankrupt him completely, but it also sent a message to other potential elder abusers about the real financial consequences of these crimes. Vanessa's sentencing was more complex because of the children involved. Ms. Brooks, you are Mrs. Whitmore's daughter. She gave birth to you, raised you as a single mother, supported your education, and helped fund your wedding and your home. The betrayal you've committed against someone who sacrificed so much for you represents a particularly heinous form of elder abuse. The prosecutor had revealed details during the trial that even I hadn't known about. Vanessa had been researching my finances and discussing strategies for accessing my assets for over 2 years, long before Derek's notebook was created. She had been the mastermind, using Derek's administrative skills to document and implement her plans. Ms. Brooks, you manipulated your own children as weapons against their grandmother, coaching them to express concern about her living alone while simultaneously preventing them from having genuine relationships with her. You used their love for their grandmother as a tool for your own financial gain. Judge Brennan's voice carried particular scorn for this aspect of their scheme. You taught your children that elderly people are burdens to be managed rather than family members to be cherished. The damage you've done extends far beyond financial fraud. You've damaged the next generation's understanding of family loyalty and respect for elders. Vanessa received 3 years in federal prison, with the possibility of supervised release after 18 months if she completed extensive counseling and community service focused on elder abuse education. But the real consequence was the loss of custody of Grace and Michael. Given Ms. Brooks' demonstrated willingness to manipulate her own children for financial gain and her systematic emotional abuse of their grandmother, this court finds that the children's best interests require removal from her custody. Kevin and Linda, Derek's brother and sister-in-law, had petitioned for custody of Grace and Michael. During the trial, they had expressed horror at Derek's actions and genuine concern for the children's well-being. Judge Brennan had approved their petition with specific provisions for the children to maintain contact with me if they chose to do so. The civil proceedings that followed the criminal sentencing were even more satisfying. Patricia Bellingham had built an airtight case for damages that went far beyond simple financial recovery. The court awarded punitive damages that reflected the calculated nature of their abuse and the broader impact their actions could have had on other elderly people. Mrs. Whitmore was not simply a victim of theft, the civil court judge ruled. She was the target of a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign designed to destroy her confidence, her independence, and ultimately her autonomy. The defendants attempted to steal not just her money, but her very sense of self-worth and dignity. The total civil judgment was $750,000, representing not just recovery of funds they had cost me, but acknowledgement of the emotional trauma and violation I had experienced. Even more importantly, the judgment included provisions that would prevent Derek and Vanessa from ever benefiting from my estate, even if they outlived me. But the most meaningful moment came during the victim impact portion of the sentencing, when I finally had the opportunity to address Derek and Vanessa directly in court. For months, you told me that I had lost my purpose after retirement, I said, standing at the podium and looking directly at both of them. You suggested that my life no longer had value because I wasn't producing income or raising children. You tried to convince me that I was a burden who was selfishly hoarding resources that could be put to better use. Vanessa was crying, but I felt no sympathy for her tears. These were the tears of someone facing consequences, not someone feeling genuine remorse. What you failed to understand is that purpose isn't something that disappears when you reach a certain age. Purpose is something you choose, every day, based on your values and your commitment to making the world better. I paused, looking around the courtroom at the advocates, prosecutors, and observers who had come to witness this moment. You've given me the greatest purpose of my retirement years. Because of your actions, I've established a foundation that has already helped 12 elderly people escape financial abuse from their own families. I've funded legal aid services that provide free representation to elderly victims. I've created educational programs that teach seniors how to recognize and resist manipulation. Derek stared at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. But Vanessa looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what she had lost through her choices. The money you tried to steal from me is now working to protect other grandparents from exactly what you did to me. The house you plan to sell is now collateral for a revolving fund that provides emergency housing for elderly people who have been financially abused. The assets you counted on inheriting are creating scholarships for students who understand that education is about serving others, not just serving yourself. As I concluded my statement, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before Charles died. Not because Derek and Vanessa were being punished, but because their punishment was creating something positive that would outlast all of us. You told me I had no purpose, I said as my final words to them. Thank you for helping me find the most meaningful purpose of my entire life. The gavel came down and justice was served. But more importantly, the Second Chapter Foundation was just getting started, and I had work to do. 3 years after Derek and Vanessa's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of the Second Chapter Foundation headquarters, looking out at 37 elderly people who had become more than clients. They had become my extended family. Each person in that room had survived financial abuse by their own adult children, and each had found not just justice, but renewed purpose through our work together. The foundation had grown beyond anything I had imagined when I first conceived it in Patricia Bellingham's office. What started as my personal response to betrayal had evolved into a national network with chapters in 14 states. We had helped over 300 elderly people escape financial manipulation, recovered more than $8 million in stolen assets, and more importantly, restored dignity and independence to people who had been told they no longer mattered. Dr. Whitmore, said Margaret Chen, our newest board member and a recent victim of her son's financial fraud, I wanted to share some news from the Washington State chapter. We just secured our 15th criminal conviction this year, and the prosecutor says our victim support model is being adopted by 3 more states. The room erupted in applause. These victories weren't just statistics to us. Each conviction represented someone's grandmother or grandfather who would sleep safely in their own home instead of being manipulated into unnecessary care facilities. But the most meaningful transformation in my life hadn't come from the foundation's success or the legal victories. It had come from an unexpected letter I'd received 6 months earlier, written in Grace's careful 13-year-old handwriting. Dear Grandma Eleanor, it had read, I'm old enough now to understand what really happened at your birthday party 3 years ago. Uncle Kevin and Aunt Linda explained everything to me and Michael. We want you to know that we never stopped loving you, and we never believed the things Mom and Dad said about you. Can we please visit you? We miss you so much, and we want to see the amazing work you're doing with your foundation. That letter had led to what I now consider the most important conversation of my retirement years. Grace and Michael, now 13 and 11, had visited me on a Saturday afternoon in September, accompanied by Kevin and Linda, who had proven to be loving and stable guardians. Grandma Eleanor, Michael had said, sitting in my living room that had once been surveilled and appraised by his parents. Uncle Kevin says, you help other grandparents when their kids are mean to them. Is that really your job now? It's one of the things I do, I had explained. When people tried to hurt me, I learned that I could either feel sorry for myself, or I could use what happened to help other people going through the same thing. Grace, wise beyond her years, had asked the question that went straight to my heart. Are you happier now than when Mom and Dad were trying to control you?
I'd thought carefully before answering. Sweetheart, I'm sadder about losing the relationship I thought I had with your mother. But I'm happier knowing who I really am and what I'm capable of when people try to tell me I don't matter. The children had spent the afternoon helping me prepare materials for a presentation I was giving to law enforcement officers about recognizing elder abuse patterns. Grace had organized evidence folders with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd once brought to her art projects. Michael had helped me practice my speech, offering suggestions about which parts might be confusing to people who hadn't experienced manipulation themselves. "You know what I think, Grandma Eleanor?" Grace had said as they prepared to leave. "I think Mom and Dad thought they were so smart, but they accidentally helped you become the most important person in lots of grandparents' lives." Those regular visits with Grace and Michael had become the highlight of my weeks. Kevin and Linda had been remarkably supportive of the children maintaining a relationship with me, understanding that I was their grandmother regardless of what their parents had done. The kids were thriving in their new home, excelling in school, and most importantly, learning what healthy family relationships looked like. Vanessa had been released after 18 months and had moved across the country, ostensibly to, quote, start fresh, but more likely to escape the notoriety her case had generated. She'd sent one letter to me during her supervised release, a stilted apology that her parole officer had probably required her to write. I hadn't responded. Some relationships, once broken by such profound betrayal, simply cannot be repaired. Derek had served his full sentence and was now working in a warehouse in Ohio, struggling to rebuild a life after losing everything he'd thought he was entitled to. I occasionally received updates from Rachel Morrison, who kept tabs on both of them to ensure they weren't attempting to manipulate other elderly people. So far, their financial situation was so precarious they couldn't afford to implement any sophisticated schemes. But the most satisfying update had come from Dr. James Thornfield, the geriatrician who had been deceived into participating in their birthday intervention. He had since become one of our foundation's strongest medical advisors and had developed screening protocols that helped healthcare providers identify elderly patients who might be experiencing family-based financial abuse. "Eleanor," he'd told me during our last consultation, "what happened to you has changed how I practice medicine. I now ask different questions, look for different warning signs, and most importantly, I never assume that family members always have a patient's best interests at heart." This afternoon's foundation meeting was particularly special because we were celebrating the completion of our most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive training program for elder law attorneys, law enforcement officers, and social workers. The curriculum we'd developed was being implemented in law schools and police academies across the country. "Dr. Whitmore," said James Patterson, a retired police detective who had joined our staff after his own mother was victimized by a similar scheme, "I wanted to read you something from the evaluation forms we received from last week's training session in Denver." He pulled out a letter from a prosecutor who had attended our program. She wrote, "The second chapter Foundation's training completely changed how our office approaches elder abuse cases. We now understand that these aren't just financial crimes. They're psychological warfare campaigns that require specialized investigation techniques and victim support services. 3 cases that we would have previously dismissed as family disputes are now being prosecuted as the serious felonies they actually are." As the meeting concluded and our team members headed home to their own families and lives, I remained in the conference room, looking through photos from our recent expansion into Texas. The images showed elderly people who had been told by their children that they were burdens, wastes of space, people whose lives no longer had value, and who had fought back and won. Dr. Abigail Hartwell's inheritance had made all of this possible, but it was Derek and Vanessa's betrayal that had shown me how to use that gift meaningfully. They had tried to convince me that retirement meant irrelevance, that aging meant becoming a burden, that my years of education and service counted for nothing once I stopped producing income. Instead, they had unwittingly launched the most impactful chapter of my entire life.
That evening, I sat in my garden, the same garden Derek had photographed and appraised for their asset assessment, reading thank you letters from people we'd helped. A grandmother in Oregon whose son had tried to steal her house, a widower in Florida whose daughter had drained his bank account, a retired teacher in Michigan whose children had attempted to have her declared incompetent so they could control her pension. Each story was different, but the pattern was always the same. Adult children who viewed their elderly parents as inconvenient obstacles to their own financial goals, who used love and family loyalty as weapons, who tried to convince vibrant, capable people that their lives no longer had meaning. And each story had the same ending now. People who had discovered that fighting back wasn't just possible, it was empowering. As the sun set over my neighborhood, The neighborhood I still lived in the house I still owned, surrounded by the books and memories that Derek and Vanessa had tried to liquidate. I reflected on something Grace had said during her last visit. "Grandma Eleanor, when I grow up, I want to be like you. Not the you that Mom and Dad tried to make you into, but the real you, the one who fights for people and never gives up." I had spent 37 years as Professor Eleanor Whitmore, educating young minds and contributing to academic scholarship. Those had been meaningful, purposeful years that I was proud of. But at 71 years old, I had discovered that the most important work of my life was just beginning. Every elderly person we helped, every criminal conviction we secured, every family we kept together by stopping financial abuse, it all proved something Derek and Vanessa had never understood. Purpose doesn't disappear when you retire. It transforms. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very determined, it becomes more powerful than anything you've ever done before. My daughter had said I lost my purpose after retirement. She was wrong. I had found it in rewriting my will, and in rewriting the story of what it means to grow older in America. The second chapter foundation wasn't just helping elderly people fight back against financial abuse. We were changing the narrative about aging itself, proving that wisdom, experience, and accumulated resources aren't burdens to be managed, but assets to be leveraged for justice. And we were just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.